The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on the employment and livelihoods of millions of migrant workers in China, especially in manufacturing and construction sectors. These workers are from rural areas or are classified as such through the strict Hukou household registration system, which dictates residential rights including migration and taxation. They comprise a third of the country's workforce and are the backbone of China's economic growth. However, due to the lockdowns and outbreaks, many of these workers lost their jobs or income for months as China pursued a zero-COVID policy. For example, in Shanghai, nearly 25 million people were restricted to their homes for more than 2 months, bringing almost all economic and social activities to a halt. Many migrant workers had no work during this period and received no government assistance. Some had to rely on loans from friends or relatives to survive. Some migrant workers found new jobs in COVID control, such as testing residents, enforcing lockdowns, staffing isolation wards, and running mass testing campaigns. These jobs were often precarious, stressful, and poorly paid. They also exposed the workers to health risks and discrimination. Some workers had to travel across the country to different outbreak sites, leaving behind their families and communities. Despite the hardships, most migrant workers chose to stay in cities rather than return to their economically backward hometowns. They hoped to find better opportunities and living conditions in urban areas once the pandemic was over. However, they also faced challenges such as rising living costs, limited social services, unequal education and health care access, and lack of legal protection. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the vulnerability and inequality of migrant workers in China. It has also highlighted their resilience and contribution to society. As China recovers from the crisis, it needs to address the long-standing issues that affect migrant workers' rights and well-being. It also needs to recognize their role as essential workers and citizens in the country's development. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on the lives and livelihoods of millions of workers in China. Many of them faced unpaid wages, layoffs, and poor working conditions amid the lockdowns and travel restrictions imposed by the authorities to contain the virus. Some of them decided to protest against these injustices, risking their freedom and safety. One of the most affected groups was the migrant workers, who make up about a third of China's urban workforce. They work in sectors such as manufacturing, construction, and service, often with low wages and no social security. When the pandemic hit, many of them lost their jobs or were unable to return to work due to travel bans and quarantine measures. Some of them were stranded in their hometowns without income or support, while others were stuck in their workplaces without pay or protection. According to a report by China Labor Bulletin, a Hong Kong-based labor rights group, there were at least 1,213 collective labor disputes in China in 2020, a 20% increase from 2019. Many of these disputes involve migrant workers demanding unpaid wages, severance pay, or compensation for occupational injuries. Some examples are, in February 2020, more than 100 migrant workers staged a sit-in at a construction site in Guangzhou, demanding over 10 million yuan, $1.5 million, in unpaid wages. They said they had not been paid for 6 months and had no money to buy food or return home. In April 2020, hundreds of migrant workers blocked a highway in Hubei province, protesting against their employer's failure to pay them for 3 months. They also complained that they had been forced to work overtime without extra pay during the lockdown. In June 2020, dozens of migrant workers clashed with the police in Shenzhen after they were evicted from their dormitories by their employer, a garment factory that had closed down due to the pandemic. They said they had not received any compensation or social insurance. Another group that faced hardship during the pandemic was the college graduates, who entered a bleak job market with few opportunities and fierce competition. According to official data, about 10.8 million college students graduated in 2020, a record high. However, the urban unemployment rate for those aged 16 to 24 was 13.1% in December 2020, much higher than the national average of 5.2%. Some of the college graduates also joined the ranks of protesters, expressing their dissatisfaction with the lack of employment prospects and social justice. Some examples are, in July 2020, hundreds of college graduates protested outside the Human Resources Bureau in Zhengzhou, Hunan Province, accusing the government of fraud and corruption in the civil service exam. They said they had been cheated out of their scores and denied their rightful positions. In August 2020, dozens of college graduates staged a sit-in at a hotel in Beijing, demanding an explanation from an online education company that had hired them, but then canceled their contracts without notice or compensation. In October 2020, several college graduates held up banners outside a subway station in Shanghai, calling for equal rights and opportunities for young people. They said they were discriminated against by employers who preferred candidates with work experience or connections. The authorities responded to these protests with a mix of repression and appeasement. On one hand, they deployed riot police, plainclothes agents, and surveillance cameras to disperse, detain, or intimidate the protesters. They also censored online discussions and media reports about the labor unrest. On the other hand, they announced some measures to support enterprises and protect workers, such as distributing living allowances to unemployed migrant workers and subsidizing companies that hired young people. However, these measures were seen by many as inadequate and insufficient to address the root causes of the workers' grievances and demands. The workers also faced legal and institutional barriers to organize themselves and bargain collectively for their rights and interests. As a result, many of them remained dissatisfied and disillusioned with the system that failed to protect them during the pandemic.